I wasn't spying on you, I swear.
Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost?
Because I think I just did. Those scars. No human should have them.
You're starting to scare me.
You don't know what you really are. Who's watching us? They know you survived.
Bring the human alive.
The employment agency that placed Velshira with Dr. Mara Chen was not a real employment agency. It existed on paper, or the human equivalent of paper, which was apparently called a database, and lived somewhere intangible called a server, and it had 3 years of operating history, a functional website, 14 fabricated client reviews, and a contact number that routed through a Keth Dominion communications relay 47 light-years from Earth. Velshira had memorized all of it, along with her cover name, her cover history, her cover personality, and the 17 most common reasons a member of the Velshi people might seek domestic employment on a human world. The 17th reason was genuine economic necessity, and it was by far the most believable because it was also the most accurate. The Velshi had been offering domestic and service labor across 32 spacefaring civilizations for 2 centuries. They were small, averaging 1.5 meters in height, with large dark eyes adapted for low-light environments, 4-fingered hands with fine motor control that put most species' dexterity to shame, and a physiological inability to produce the hormones associated with aggression. That last trait was documented in every xenobiological catalog in the known galaxy, which made it very useful to anyone who needed a face that no one was afraid of. This was, of course, precisely why the Keth Dominion used them. Velshira arrived at Dr. Mara Chen's address on a Thursday morning in late October, stepping out of a rental vehicle with 1 bag, a letter of introduction printed in the agency's letterhead, and the practiced expression of quiet eagerness she had rehearsed for 11 days aboard a Keth transit vessel. The house sat at the edge of the Colorado Plateau, a low structure of native stone and old timber that looked like it had been assembled by someone who cared more about the view than about impressing anyone who might visit. Red canyon walls rose to the south and west. The sky was enormous in the way that desert skies are enormous, not just large but assertive, occupying your attention whether you directed it there or not. Velshira noted it the way she noted everything in those first minutes, as data, filed and categorized, assigned its place in the emerging map of the assignment. Large open sky, minimal covered positions, elevation approximately 2,000 meters, line of sight to any neighboring structure negligible, a tactically isolated position, useful to know, not her area of concern. She was not here for tactics. She was here to watch, to remember, and to transmit. She rang the bell at 7:58, 2 minutes early. Her briefing materials had indicated that humans often interpreted early arrival as a favorable quality. The woman who opened the door was not what the dossier had led Velshira to expect. Dr. Mara Chen was 63 years old, according to the file, though human aging remained genuinely difficult for Velshira to read at anything other than a general level. What she had anticipated was someone organized in the manner of a career researcher, contained, methodical, the kind of person who wore their profession lightly but consistently, who would look at an incoming domestic worker with the polite assessment of someone accustomed to managing the operational details of their own household. What she found was a woman who appeared to have been interrupted mid-thought, with silver-streaked black hair loose around her shoulders, a coffee mug in one hand and a small yellow bird perched on her other wrist, looking at Velshira with an expression of clear-eyed, unconcerned interest that was in no discernible way the expression of someone startled by the arrival of a stranger at their door. "You're early," Mara Chen said, and smiled in a way that engaged the muscles around her eyes as well as her mouth, which Velshira's behavioral database flagged as a marker of genuine, rather than performed warmth. "Come in. Don't worry about miso. She bites, but only if you deserve it. I am punctual to a fault," Velshira said, in the accent she had practiced until it sat naturally, and stepped inside. The interior smelled like coffee and old books, and the particular warmth that wood floors hold when a building has been lived in long enough to absorb the accumulated heat of ordinary days. Books covered every horizontal surface that was not a chair or a table. Photographs filled the hallway walls so completely that the wall itself was almost invisible beneath them, an entire surface composed of faces and moments, framed in everything from simple black wood to elaborate hand-carved borders that had the quality of having traveled a considerable distance and a considerable amount of time to end up here. Velshira moved her attention across them with the practiced peripheral efficiency of someone trained to observe, without appearing to observe. Some showed a younger Mara alongside people in military dress, the kind of informal photographs taken in the field rather than at ceremonies. Others were portraits of individuals she did not recognize. Several had dates written in the corner in handwriting that Velshira would later confirm was Mara's. The dates were all in the past. Some of them were the same year. She catalogued. In the part of her mind reserved for cataloging, subject maintains strong emotional attachment to deceased individuals. Evidence of military or government-adjacent connection. Likely proximity rather than direct service. Photographs function as sentimental anchors rather than status indicators. No obvious security awareness in the arrangement of the space. Your room is through here, Mara said, turning left toward a shorter hallway. The room was not the room Velshira had been told to expect. The agency communication had described a small room near the laundry facilities, the kind typically assigned to domestic workers in human households. The room Mara was opening was larger, with a wide window positioned to catch the afternoon light from the canyon, a bed that had clearly been made with care rather than expediency, and a window seat, cushioned in dark green fabric that invited extended sitting. There was a bookshelf already stocked, a desk with a good lamp, a small landscape painting on the far wall that someone had chosen thoughtfully rather than placed by default. Mara set her coffee mug on the edge of the desk. The bird stepped from her wrist to the mug handle with the unhurried certainty of long habit. "You're in the guest room," Mara said, looking around the room in the way someone looks around a familiar space as if briefly seeing it fresh. "Not the servants' quarters. There's a difference, and I think you already knew that, which is exactly why you're standing there, trying to figure out why." Velshira experienced a pause of approximately 3 seconds that fell within her allowable window for thoughtful appreciation rather than visible calculation.
"It is a very beautiful room," she said.
"Thank you, Dr. Chen." "Mara," the doctor said immediately, waving it off. "Nobody calls me Dr. Chen. I had a colleague who called me doctor for 15 years, and I could never determine whether it was respect or whether she'd simply forgotten my first name." She moved toward the door. "There are clean towels in the cabinet. The Wi-Fi password is on the notepad by the kettle. If my soul lands on you, don't make any sudden movements and offer her your finger to step onto. She likes that. It makes her feel important." She left, and the room settled into quiet, and Velshira stood in the center of it and breathed slowly, the way her mission trainer had taught her when she needed to recalibrate after an unexpected variable. She ran the last 90 seconds back through her analysis. The room assignment, the statement about the difference, the watching look that had accompanied it, not suspicious exactly, more like the look of someone who was accustomed to watching, and had decided there was no particular reason to conceal this. She ran it all through the decision framework she had internalized during training and arrived at the same assessment. On every pass, there was no strategic reason for Mara-chan to put her in the guest room. It was not ignorance of social convention. The woman was clearly intelligent and attentive. It was not an attempt to unsettle. The offer had been made with the easy warmth of someone who had long since made a decision and was comfortable with it. It was the decision of someone who did not see a hierarchy where the situation assumed one. Velshira filed it as a data point in the category of human social behaviors variant and went to look out the window. The window box on the exterior sill was empty. The box itself was well maintained, the kind that had clearly been regularly tended, but it held only dark soil, recently cleared by the look of it, as though something had been removed within the last week or two. Velshira noted the absence. She noted it and continued noting it for approximately 4 seconds before she filed it under the same category as the room assignment data points that did not yet connect to anything and moved to unpack her single bag. The first day resolved into its routines. She identified where things were kept. She learned the timing of Mara's schedule, calls from early morning until near noon, in a voice that was sometimes thoughtful and exploratory, and sometimes stripped to a kind of deliberate precision that was noticeably different from the everyday version. Lunch around noon, eaten without much attention, food clearly a logistical function rather than a pleasure. Afternoons split between reading and walking the canyon trail that began at the edge of the property and wound south toward a rim overlook. Mara invited her to join the evening walk, which she did, and they walked without urgency and without much talk, and Velshira watched the light change on the canyon walls and filed the visit data and did not think about the light itself. At the rim, Mara stopped and looked out at the distance and said, "I lost someone in the Callisto engagement. Her name was Torres. She used to say the best thing about deep space was that it didn't care if you were having a bad day." She paused. "I think about that sometimes when I'm out here. The canyon's a little like that." "I am sorry for your loss," Velshira said, because it was the appropriate response, and because she meant it in the proportion available to her at that stage of an assignment she had been in for less than 12 hours. Mara nodded at the distance. She also said that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is something that has learned to stop flinching. A small pause.
I was never entirely certain if she meant it as a warning or a compliment.
She found a small stone on the rim and held it for a moment, then let it drop over the edge into the empty space below. "Come on, I'll make dinner. You can tell me about your people." Velshira told the cover story over dinner, detailed, internally consistent, credible, and Mara listened with the focused quality of someone who was either genuinely curious or very practiced at appearing to be. After dinner, in her room, Velshira composed the first report. She described the target as emotionally open, unguarded in her social behavior, displaying pronounced attachment to deceased individuals, showing no behavioral evidence of defensive awareness. She listed the access she had been given, the physical layout of the dwelling, the preliminary assessment of vulnerability. She noted, at the end, the empty window box with no allergy-reactive flora, marked it as status unknown, and transmitted the whole thing to the Keth relay before closing the device. She lay in the dark afterward with the window cracked open 2 centimeters, because the night air at this altitude had a clean, cold quality she had not encountered before, and she found she liked it. She told herself this was not data, and filed the distinction and closed her eyes, and lay there for a long time, thinking about a woman who had dropped a stone over a canyon rim and could not decide if the thing Torres had said was a warning or a compliment. In the morning, Mara was at the counter. When Velshira came into the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking out the window at the canyon, with the particular stillness of someone who had been there for some time before deciding to be still about it. When Velshira appeared, she turned and said, "Good morning," and poured a second mug without being asked and pushed it across the counter and turned back to the window. "There was a climbing rose in that window box," she said, after a moment, without preamble, as though continuing a conversation that had been happening somewhere outside the range of audible speech. "Very old. I grew it from a cutting my mother gave me." She paused. "I had to take it out last week, something wrong with the soil. I probably won't replant until spring." "That is a shame," Velshira said. "Yes," Mara agreed, "it really is." She turned from the window, and the moment concluded, and breakfast began, and Velshira sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee that Mara had poured, without being asked, and thought about soil that needed to be cleared at exactly the moment a domestic worker had been scheduled to arrive. And she told herself the timing meant nothing, and she put it in the same filing category as the room, and the stone dropped into the canyon and moved on with the work. She was very good at moving on with the work. It was the quality that had made her valuable enough to be deployed, and she applied it now with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. And by the 5th day, she had assembled a detailed and credible picture of a civilian researcher living alone in a remote house, managing grief and reading and making soup and walking the canyon trail, who was in every observable respect exactly what the dossier had described and exactly the kind of target the briefing had told her to expect. She transmitted reports 3 and 4. She refined her assessment categories. She did not think about the window box. She told herself she was not thinking about it, which was the kind of thing you have to tell yourself multiple times before it becomes even partly true. And she was in the process of telling herself for the 5th or 6th time on the evening of the 5th day when Mara came in from a long walk with red eyes that had nothing to do with the wind and began making soup from memory. "Today's the anniversary," Mara said, not turning from the stove. "Callisto, Torres, and 7 others, 22 years. Velshira said, "I am sorry. That is a long time to carry something." 22 years and it still shows up like a stranger at the door. Mara stirred the soup. Torres told me once that the worst thing about grief isn't the pain. It's that it never gets smaller. You just get bigger around it. She paused. I've always thought that was either very wise or complete nonsense, and I have never once been able to decide which. Perhaps both at the same time, Velshira said. Mara turned from the stove and looked at her directly, with the quality of attention that Velshira had noted on the first morning and had not yet found the right category for. Not suspicious, not hostile, more like recalibrating against new information. Yes, Mara said, after a moment that held more than moments usually hold. Perhaps both at the same time. A pause. Thank you for that. That night Velshira stood in the hallway and looked at the photographs, slowly, in the way she had not allowed herself to look at them before. She found Torres near the top cluster, a dark-eyed woman in Earth Defense Navy dress, caught laughing at something beyond the frame. One arm around a younger Mara, with the relaxed familiarity of someone who has stood close to this person many times. Below that photograph were more uniformed faces, some of them with dates written in Mara's handwriting, and some of those dates were the same year as the one Mara had named tonight. She stood in the hallway for a long time and looked at all of it, at the specific weight of a wall that someone had built out of the people they had not been able to keep, and she thought about what it meant to do that, to put the faces right there where you would walk past them every day, where you could not go to or from any room in the house without passing them. And she thought about what kind of person makes that choice about their own home, and why. She went to her room. She composed Report 5. She deleted 3 drafts before settling on a version that contained no reference to standing in hallways and no reference to the specific gravity of photographs, because these were not data points that served the mission objective. They were something else. She was having some difficulty determining what. She transmitted and closed the device and lay in the dark, and the night air came through the 2-centimeter gap in the window, and she did not sleep for a long time. The second week settled into itself with the inevitability of water finding low ground. Velshira cleaned and cooked and observed, and Mara worked and walked and read, and they ate together most evenings at the small kitchen table, and talked with the exploratory ease of not yet certain of each other, but were not unfriendly about the uncertainty. Velshira had done this kind of work twice before, in shorter postings with less significant targets, and she knew the rhythm of it. You kept yourself slightly behind the threshold of full presence. You were warm enough to be trusted, unremarkable enough to be forgotten. You let the space between yourself and the target open into something like domesticity, because domesticity was invisible, and invisible was what you needed to be. The problem was that Mara Chen had an inconvenient quality of attention that kept finding Velshira in the room and directing itself at her. Not in the manner of someone conducting surveillance. Velshira knew what that felt like. The elaborate not looking of someone who was actually looking with considerable intensity, but in the ordinary manner of someone who inhabited a shared space and saw no particular reason to look elsewhere. This was theoretically ideal for the mission. A target who was not watching you could not catch you watching them. In practice, Velshira found it significantly more difficult to manage than open suspicion would have been, because you can construct a response to suspicion, and you cannot easily construct a response to the sustained, comfortable attention of someone who simply seems to find you interesting. She compensated by increasing the precision and rigor of her reports. She noted that Mara slept approximately 6 hours a night, which was near the lower threshold of the human optimal range, according to Velshira's medical database, and that she rose before dawn most mornings to sit in the kitchen with coffee and whatever she had been reading the night before, or in the canyon-facing window when the reading had run out, and the quiet was sufficient on its own. She noted that Mara ate without attention, food being operationally necessary in her apparent assessment rather than a source of pleasure, except for coffee, which she prepared with a carefulness bordering on ceremony, grinding the beans at a specific coarseness, heating the water to a specific temperature, pouring at a specific rate. She noted that Mara performed a physical practice called Tai Chi in the pre-dawn hour before the household was expected to be awake, moving through the sequence alone on the stone patio that faced the eastern canyon wall. Velshira watched this through a narrow gap in the curtains on 3 separate mornings. The movements were precisely controlled, Each position held just slightly longer than seemed natural. The weight of the body shifting with the particular ease of something that had been practiced past the point where it requires conscious management. The practice looked like rest. It looked, Velshira thought with a precision that surprised her, like someone who had learned to be completely still, in ways that were not the same as being at peace but had become, through repetition, indistinguishable from it. She reported, subject exhibits physical discipline and stress management capacity, significantly inconsistent with the emotional vulnerability patterns observed in behavioral contexts involving grief or personal disclosure. Preliminary vulnerability rating revised downward. Physical conditioning suggests sustained and serious training. No combat records appear in accessible databases, but accessible databases are not exhaustive. She had been looking for records. This was the work, and she did it with the thoroughness her assignment required, pulling whatever was available in the human data systems the Keth analysts had given her access to. What she found was accurate as far as it went. Mara Chen, researcher, civilian advisory designation attached to Earth Defense Command at a senior level, publications in several fields that overlapped in ways that suggested an unusually broad foundational education. A full career visible in the record, with one gap. 3 years in her early 30s, during which she had published nothing, and based on the absence of time-stamped records in the systems Velshira could reach, apparently gone nowhere that the ordinary administrative infrastructure of professional life leaves traces. The gap was followed by her current advisory role, which had been her primary designation for the 20 years since. 3 years was a long gap. Velshira noted it and kept looking. On the 9th night, they sat in the living room after dinner, later than usual, because Mara's afternoon call had run long, and Mara poured something amber from a bottle on the sideboard and raised an eyebrow at Velshira in a question that needed no words. Velshira said she didn't drink, which was true, and took the chair near the window. Mara settled into the couch with the familiarity of long habit, tucking one leg underneath her, and they sat in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 9 days without anyone planning it. Outside, the canyon was invisible in the dark, but present in the way that large things are present, even when you cannot see them, registered as weight and depth rather than image. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said, not looking at Velshira but at the dark window, as if the question was directed at the distance. "Of course," Velshira said. "What's it like, coming to a new world, among people who are, from your perspective, completely alien, having to figure out the codes, what they mean when they say one thing in a way that means another? How they decide who deserves their trust?" She paused. The whole process of learning someone. It was a genuinely curious question, delivered with the weight of someone who had been thinking about the subject for a while before giving it voice. Velshira gave the prepared answer. The strangeness of learning new routines, the patience required to understand how different species organized their shared spaces, the Velshi tradition of adaptation as a form of respect for the host culture. She said it well. She believed parts of it. Mara listened without interruption. When Velshira finished, she said, "That's a very gracious answer." A pause that was not hostile but was evaluative. "I learned something a long time ago, in work that involved a lot of behavioral decoding. Not the electronic kind, the other kind. Reading people who are showing you one thing and meaning something adjacent or opposite." She swirled the amber liquid in her glass. "The thing I kept coming back to was the difference between deliberate display and involuntary disclosure. What people choose to show you versus what they can't help but show you regardless of intention. The deliberate stuff is curated. It's the picture they've decided you get." She paused. "The involuntary stuff is where the actual information lives." Velshira said nothing. The silence had a quality to it. "The kindest approach, I always thought," Mara continued, with the reflective tone of someone walking a familiar path of thought, "is to be genuinely clear about what you're showing. To give someone precisely the picture you've decided they're ready for, and not one detail more or less. There's a kind of respect in it. You're trusting them to be able to handle what they're seeing, even if they don't understand it yet." She raised the glass in a gesture that was not quite a toast. "To clarity," she said. "To clarity," Velshira said, and the 2 words in her mouth tasted like something that had more dimensions than words usually have. She wrote Report 6 that night. She wrote, "Subject made reference to behavioral decoding and the distinction between deliberate and involuntary disclosure in a conversational register that did not present as direct or hostile. Impossible to determine from behavioral indicators whether this represents general professional knowledge or indicates awareness of observation. Subject displays a very high comfort with unresolved ambiguity, both in verbal expression and behavioral presentation. Standard stress markers absent. Either she suspects nothing and is philosophically inclined, or she suspects everything and is extraordinarily composed. She added at the bottom, cannot determine which. Then she transmitted it and sat for a while, looking at the device before she put it away. On the 11th day, she saw the file. She had not been looking for files. She had access to most of the house. Mara moved through the space without closing doors, without apparent concern about what a domestic worker might encounter, and she had been careful about what she did with that access, taking nothing she had not been given, observing without creating evidence of observation. She had gone into the study to water the plant on the windowsill, which Mara had asked her to do while she was on a long call, and the call was ongoing. Mara's voice behind the closed door, carrying the stripped-down precision register that Velshira associated with the most significant conversations she overheard. She watered the plant and turned to leave, and the file was there on the corner of the desk. It was a physical file. Paper inside a cardstock cover, the kind of document the oldest institutional system still produced on physical media. It was not fully closed. The cover stood open by perhaps a centimeter, enough to register the presence of pages inside, enough to catch the eye of someone passing. Velshira stood and looked at it. The part of her mind trained for this work said, a file left partially open in a space to which you have regular, sanctioned access. The access was offered rather than taken. The file is positioned at the corner of the desk closest to the door, at standing eye height. This is either an oversight or it is deliberate. If deliberate, reading it is precisely what it was placed there to cause you to do. A carefully placed document can be as precisely engineered as any other piece of deception. She left it where it was. She watered the plant and crossed to the door and stepped out and pulled it to its original position behind her, and went to the kitchen and made tea, and sat at the table, thinking about the quality of an oversight that places a document in the exact sightline of the person you are apparently unconcerned about. And she thought about what Mara had said the night before, about giving someone precisely the picture you had decided they were ready for. And she held both thoughts very still, and did not look directly at either of them. She transmitted Report 7. It was the shortest she had written, routine observations, nothing significant. She did not mention the file. If it was a test, she had passed the surface version of it. Whether passing was the correct answer was a different question that she could not resolve with available information. That evening Mara came out of the study late and accepted tea that Velshira already had ready and sat across the table from her in the kitchen with the particular tiredness of concentration rather than physical effort, and was quiet for a while before she said, have you ever had to make a decision that was wrong by every available measure and still felt like the most correct thing you'd ever done? Velshira thought about the file she had not opened. She thought about the reports she had sent that left certain things out. She thought about the difference, which she was increasingly uncomfortable examining directly. Yes, she said, and meant enough of it that the word came out without visible difficulty. Mara nodded. This was a sufficient answer. Me too. Twice, she held the mug in both hands. Both times it worked. Third time, who knows, she stood. Good night, Velshira. Good night, Velshira said. She sat at the kitchen table after Mara was gone and listened to the canyon night outside, to the wind that came off the rim at this hour, with a sound like something very large breathing, and she thought about files that were opened or not opened, and data that was transmitted or not, and a gap of 3 years in a professional record that contained exactly what it had been designed to contain, and she thought about clarity, which was apparently what you arrived at, when you had been given exactly the picture that someone had decided you were ready for. She washed the mugs. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. A cold front dropped off the Rockies at the start of the 3rd week and pushed hard across the plateau for 2 days, and the canyon light changed from late October amber to something harder and more transparent, the kind of light that strips the softness from surfaces and makes everything exact. Velshira found she preferred it. There was a quality of honesty in that kind of light that she had grown to value over the course of 17 days in this house. even as she had found it increasingly difficult to define exactly what kind of honesty she meant. She had begun to experience doubt, not doubt about the mission itself, not the kind of doubt that erodes purpose. She knew what she was here to do, and she continued doing it with precision. The doubt was narrower, and in some ways more difficult. She was doubting the frame she was applying to what she observed. Every behavioral model her training had given her placed humans in a legible taxonomy: emotionally driven, inconsistently rational, powerful in aggregate, unpredictable in individual decision-making, but readable through the standard set of motivating factors: fear, grief, status-seeking, desire. Watch for these. Identify them. Build the vulnerability profile from them. The methodology was sound, and she had applied it with rigor, and the reports she had sent were accurate. The problem was that Dr. Mara Chen did not appear to have vulnerability in the sense the model defined it. She had plenty of what the model called levers: the photographs, the anniversary grief, the 3 years that weren't in the record, the conversations that bent toward philosophy at exactly the moments Velshira was paying closest attention. But all of these things were sitting openly where anyone could see them, entirely visible, which was either the behavior of someone who had no idea they were being observed, or the behavior of someone who had made a deliberate decision about what to leave out and what to set in plain sight. She was running out of time to decide which, because the relay had sent a response to report 7, the first substantive response, rather than a simple acknowledgement, and the message said, in the compressed language of Keth operational communication, analysis timeline is being accelerated. Full assessment of target's social and strategic network within 10 days. Document any anomalous security behaviors or evidence of contact with Earth intelligence apparatus. Timeline accelerating. Velshira knew what timelines accelerated toward. She did not say this to herself directly. She said the knowledge into the part of her mind that held the things she was not examining, and she filed it there, and she went on. She told herself she already knew. She told herself she was going on. On the 17th day, Velshira saw Mara in the shower. She had not been looking. This is a fact, and it matters. She had been carrying clean towels from the laundry, the Thursday task, and the bathroom door was not fully closed. It had a tendency to drift when not pulled firmly, a small mechanical imperfection she had offered on her first week to fix, and that Mara had waved off with the expression, humans make about minor inconveniences they've decided to coexist with. The door stood open, perhaps 30 centimeters. Velshira saw, and in the same instant turned away, hard, and retreated 4 steps down the hallway and stood with her back against the wall. Among the Velshi, seeing another person's body without an explicit invitation was not merely an etiquette violation. It was one of the deepest social injuries that could be committed between individuals, carrying implications of violation and disrespect so fundamental
that the language had a specific word for it, a word used only for this and for 3 other acts of comparable severity.
Velshira had never committed it in 29 years. The fact of having done so now, accidentally, reduced her to stillness in the hallway for 19 seconds while the physiological response worked through her and left behind a residue of shame that was entirely genuine and in no way useful to the work. Then the part of her mind that had been processing what her eyes had recorded in the 2 seconds before her ethics caught up. She went to her room. She closed the door. She opened not the mission device, but her personal archive, the one with the medical and xenobiological databases she kept for reference purposes. Because good intelligence work sometimes required understanding what bodies looked like when they had sustained significant trauma. She searched for a specific visual entry and found it and sat with it on the screen. The entry was filed under combat trauma, bioweapon interaction, subcategory, cellular recovery scarring. The illustrations were detailed and comparative, showing the characteristic patterning that resulted from tissue repair following exposure to Keth Class 7 or above biological agents. The scarring was distinctive of specific topography, the skin growing back and ridged, layered formations caused by cellular regeneration under pharmaceutical suppression, the kind of intervention required when the body's ordinary inflammatory response had to be blocked to prevent systemic distribution of the biological contaminant. It left, in the language of the medical entry, a mapped quality on the surviving tissue, a record written into the skin in the notation of survival. The entry was unambiguous about survival rates. Without immediate intervention, 0. With intervention in standard medical facilities, 30 to 40%. With intervention in field-grade conditions, which accounted for combat environments where a Class 7 agent was likely to be deployed, 3 to 7%. Mara Chen's torso was covered in it. Not in the contained pattern of someone who had sustained isolated exposure in a single incident, not the small geography of someone who had been near the edge of a contamination event and gotten out. Her entire back, both sides, and across the shoulders as much as Velshira had seen before she had turned away, which was more than she had consciously
registered, until now carried the full characteristic mapping of someone who had survived
the
unsurvivable at very close range.
Velshira sat with this for a while. She sat with it the way you sit with the realization that a category you have been placing something into is the wrong category, and the right category does not yet exist in your available set. Torres had told Mara that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was something that had learned to stop flinching. Velshira added that to the calculation she was running. She added the 3-year gap in the professional record. She added the way the voice changed on certain calls, going from open and thoughtful to contained and precise, in the same way that water going over certain terrain changes its sound. She added the file that had been left on the corner of the desk at standing eye height. She added the empty window box from which a climbing rose with Velshi allergy properties had been removed within the week of her arrival. She added the guest room and the statement about the difference. Then she needed to transmit. She needed to report what she had just found, because it was significant intelligence that revised everything about the target's background and the nature of her role. This was exactly what the relay was waiting for, exactly what the timeline acceleration was driving toward. This was the work, and she was here to do it. She opened the mission device, and because she was precise, and because she could not, in good professional conscience, transmit anything without first reviewing her own communication record for consistency, she pulled up the archive of her previous reports and the acknowledgement messages, and she reviewed them now in the manner of someone searching for something they have not yet named. She found it in the 7th acknowledgement message. The routing string was longer than standard by 23 characters. She had not looked at routing strings closely before, because routing strings were administrative infrastructure, and infrastructure does not, ordinarily, carry operational information. This one did. In the extended section of the string, there was an identifier she recognized from a training document she had read 3 years ago. During her first advanced placement preparation, the identifier used for operations classified at the level of Keth High Command Strategic Deployment, the classification level above the standard analysis tier, the level that the training document had described in careful, precise language as being associated with what it called forward sacrifice operations. She had read this training document. She had not at the time expected it to become directly relevant to her professional life. She searched for the extraction protocol identifier, the code that should have been embedded in every mission brief at the time of deployment, the identifier that meant, retrieve this asset when the operation concludes, because the asset is not expendable, because the asset is a person, because there are people going home when this is finished. She looked for it in the routing string and in the mission brief she knew by memory and in the acknowledgement messages. She was thorough. She checked 3 times. There was no extraction protocol identifier. She put the device down on the bed. She picked it up again. She had missed the absence because mission briefs follow patterns, and when something follows a familiar enough pattern, the mind fills in the expected elements from the pattern itself, from the shape of how things usually go, and this is a known cognitive vulnerability in exact recall intelligence work, and she had been trained to guard against it, and she had been doing this work for 11 years, and she had fallen into it anyway. There was no extraction protocol, because there was not going to be an extraction. The quiet in the room was the quiet of a specific kind of understanding settling into place, the kind that doesn't arrive with noise because it has been arriving slowly for days. And what you're experiencing is not the arrival, but the moment you stop pretending the door isn't open. She was still sitting like that, very still, hands in her lap, device beside her, when Mara knocked twice on the door and said, "Velshira, I made tea."
I wasn't sure if you'd want some, but I thought I'd ask. A pause. The particular pause of someone choosing words. You've been quiet for a while. I thought I'd check in.
Velshira looked at the door. She looked at the mission device on the bed. She looked at her own hands, small and four-fingered, with the fine motor control that was precisely the quality the Keth Dominion valued in them because it made them useful, and the quality the galaxy at large attributed to them as a defining characteristic, and neither of those uses had ever been a thing she had chosen. "I'll be right there," she said, and her voice was even, which was something she had practiced and was glad of now. She put the device in the drawer. She went to have tea with the woman who had known from the first morning, and neither of them said a word about any of it, and the tea was very good. And outside the canyon held its particular darkness, and somewhere 47 light years away, a relay was still waiting for a transmission that was not going to come tonight. Velshira woke at 3:47 in the morning to the sound of Mara's voice coming from the study, with the door open wider than she ever left it at that hour, low and controlled, and carrying the stripped-down precision register that Velshira had heard through closed doors for 17 days, and was now hearing clearly for the first time. Fragments came through the walls. Confirmation received. Window is 7 to 9 hours. Yes, I understand the implications. No, that is still my call, and my call stands. Then silence. Then footsteps, moving toward the kitchen with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had made the decision before rising and was now simply putting their body in the right position relative to what was about to happen. The sound of water, the specific mechanical sequence of the coffee maker. Then quiet. Velshira was dressed and in the kitchen doorway within 6 minutes. Mara was at the window with her coffee, wearing the kind of jacket that had too many interior pockets to be chosen for aesthetic reasons. She turned when Velshira appeared, not startled, and said, "I was going to wake you within the hour." She poured a second mug without being asked and pushed it across the counter. "Sit down. We have some things to cover, and I want you to have time to decide how to respond before the situation requires a response." Velshira sat. She wrapped her hands around the mug. Mara leaned against the counter, the coffee in one hand, and looked at Velshira with the direct open attention that Velshira had been cataloging under the wrong heading for 17 days. "The Keth fleet crossed into the outer solar system approximately 2 hours ago," she said. "They're running on the navigation model your reports helped construct. They expect the outer perimeter to be unguarded at the insertion points you identified. They expect our primary defensive grid to be oriented toward the inner planets. They expect Titan station sensors to have a significant blind spot on the southern approach." She paused. "Those are the conclusions your reports supported. All of them are wrong." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the pre-dawn was beginning the long, slow process of deciding to become morning, a faint differentiation of darkness near the canyon wall's upper edge.
"I've known who you were since the morning you arrived," Mara said.
"The employment agency is a Keth front. We identified it 14 months ago and decided to manage it carefully rather than close it, because a known channel is worth more than an unknown one. When the Dominion placed an asset through it, we had identification within 48 hours. She held her mug with both hands, the familiar posture. "I asked to be your assignment. The original posting was a less useful fool target. I requested the transfer." "Why?" Velshira said. "Because I read your file," Mara said. "The Keth file recovered in the same operation. You're better at this than your handlers know. You're careful, you're perceptive, and you're honest in ways that are more interesting than they're useful to them, which means you've been filing reports for 11 years that told them accurate things about people, while leaving out the things that matter." She looked at Velshira directly, and because in 40 years of using Velshi people for forward intelligence work, the Dominion has never had a single asset come home. She paused to let that sit, not because none of them were detected, because detection has nothing to do with it. "I know," Velshira said. Something moved through Mara's expression, quick and complex, the kind of thing that happens when an anticipated variable resolves earlier than expected. "I know you know," she said. "I watched you figure it out. I was going to tell you that night, after the tea, but you came out of your room looking like someone who had just understood something large and needed a little time inside of it. And I thought," she paused, "you'd earned that time. A beat. I'm sorry it took this long either way." A sound reached them then that was not from inside the house. A low, sustained tone that traveled through the ground as much as through the air, the frequency of a large-scale system activating, and a moment later, the canyon wall's upper face caught a reflection from the east, blue, white, and clean. The color of something designed to illuminate very precisely at very high velocity. Earth's outer defense grid, Mara said, already moving toward the window. Right on schedule. Velshira moved to stand beside her. They stood together at the kitchen window, 2 people in the hour before dawn. Watching the sky above the canyon take on the specific quality of illumination that meant something very large, was ending at very high speed a very long distance away. Mara watched it with her coffee mug held still and her face carrying an expression that was not triumph and was not relief. It was the expression, Velshira thought, of someone who had prepared very carefully for a necessary thing and was now watching it happen and finding it neither simple nor particularly satisfying. How many ships? Velshira asked. 43 vessels in the original formation, Mara said. Based on the approach vectors and the grid coverage, we expect to neutralize approximately 30 in the first engagement window. The remaining 13 will break off. We have intercept assets positioned. She paused. We prefer not to destroy ships that are attempting to withdraw. There are crews on those vessels. They didn't make the decision to come here. Velshira turned to look at her. You prefer, she said. Yes. The Keth Fleet Command would not hold that preference. No, Mara said. They wouldn't. She turned from the window and moved to the kitchen table and sat down, and after a moment, Velshira sat across from her, the same positions they had occupied most evenings over 17 days, with the particular ease of familiarity. Mara reached to the inside pocket of the jacket and placed a folder on the table between them. She opened it. It was not intelligence analysis. It was a list. Names in the common galactic script, the shared notation every spacefaring civilization used for cross-species documentation, and beside each name a brief designation and a date. The designations were variations on a single category: forward intelligence asset, Velshi deployment. The dates were all in the past. The list was 87 names long. These are the Velshi assets the Dominion deployed in 40 years of forward operations, Mara said quietly, cross-referenced with their return records. She let Velshira look. None of them came back. Velshira looked at the names. They were Velshi names, properly constructed ones, carrying in their syllables the small markers of regional origin and family lineage that the Velshi built into naming as a matter of course. She could read the regional markers. She recognized them. These were names from the northern coasts and the equatorial plains, and the highland settlements and the river valleys, from the whole geography of a world she had grown up on, and left, and carried in memory, the way you carry the physical fact of a place you belong to, regardless of where your body happens to be. She ran one finger down the list, not reading each name but acknowledging each one, moving slowly. It took a while. Mara did not speak. At the bottom, Velshira looked up. Why did you protect me? She said. Because I've seen a list like this before, Mara said. She touched the edge of the folder. A different one, same principle. People who were used as a means to someone else's end, and then filed under outcome rather than remembered under their names. She held Velshira's gaze. I spent a long time after that being the kind of person who made the operationally correct call and came home to sit in a hallway in front of photographs. I decided I was done with that specific kind of correctness. I was your enemy's asset, Velshira said. You were a person who had been sent here to die without knowing it, Mara said, by people who were never going to let you come home. Those two things are not incompatible. The second one was the one that mattered to me. The comm device on the table activated. Mara glanced at it, and the stripped-down precision came back into her voice. This is Chen. The Keth command vessel needs to be intercepted. Yes, I understand the diplomatic precedent. The diplomatic precedent can be addressed after the command vessel is no longer running a targeting solution on a residential structure in the state of Colorado. A pause. Her expression carrying the particular patience of someone navigating an institutional obstacle she anticipated. The threat assessment is in front of you now. The authorization code is mine. Put it on record as my call. She set the device down. 3 minutes to intercept positioning, she said. We have approximately 10 before the command vessel reaches optimal firing range. Velshira looked at the list on the table. She looked at the light on the canyon wall, which was changing now, the blue-white of activation giving way to something that was beginning to be, at its furthest edge, the first color of dawn. She looked at Mara, who had known from the first morning, who had given her the guest room, and cleared, The climbing rose and told her about Torres and the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, and left a file on the edge of a desk at standing eye height, and said things about clarity and about giving people precisely the picture you had decided they were ready for, and who had been Velshira, now understood this with the fullness of something seen entire telling the absolute truth in every one of those moments, in ways that were completely different from anything Velshira had understood when she was hearing them. You planned all of this, Velshira said. The intelligence operation, Mara said. Yes, the framework. What happens inside a framework? She paused. She looked at the hallway at the photographs visible from where she sat. I had an intention, she said, more quietly. Whether it became what it became is not entirely something I planned. Some of it is something I hoped for. She looked back at Velshira. There's a difference. Velshira reached for the mission device, which she had brought to the table from her room without consciously deciding to bring it, and she opened it, and she looked at the transmission queue. The command vessel outside was running a targeting solution on this location, on the point from which 17 days of carefully calibrated intelligence had been transmitted, and in a short number of minutes it was going to reach an optimal firing range. And what happened between now and then was a decision that she understood, approaching for 17 days. She looked at the list of 87 names for a long moment. Then she looked at the secondary relay address in the mission device's communication architecture, the one she had never activated, the one she had barely registered in her initial device review, because its purpose had not seemed relevant. She knew the address. She had not chosen to know it. She had known it the way you know the address of the place you grew up, without cataloging the memorization, simply because it was home and home stays in you. Velshira, Prime. The decision did not feel like a decision. This was the thing she had not anticipated, the quality of it when it finally came. In training she had been told that significant choices carry weight, that you know the important ones because the body registers them as a change in trajectory before the mind has finished calculating. She had believed this because it was plausible, and because the person who told her had the authority of experience behind them. What she found, sitting at this table at 4:23 in the morning, with a list of 87 names in front of her, was that the decision felt like a door that had been standing open for 17 days, and she had been looking at it, and was now simply walking through. She constructed the message in the compressed burst format she had been trained to use for priority transmissions, the kind that carried significant content in a short signal window. She had been trained in this technique for emergency reporting purposes. She applied it now for the first time for a purpose that had nothing to do with what she had been trained for, and found that the technique worked equally well in either direction. The message was not tactical intelligence. It was not a vulnerability assessment or a behavioral profile or anything that would be useful to anyone planning an operation. It was a list of 87 names and an employment agency address and a routing string identifier, and a description of what all of those things meant taken together, and at the end of it, in Velshi, 7 words she had not spoken aloud in years. The world is larger than they told us. She sent it. The mission device made the specific ascending hum of a full power burst transmission, the kind that pressed against the limits of its transmission architecture to reach the furthest possible relay. And then the hum cut off, and the message was traveling, and what she had done was done. Mara had been watching her. When Velshira put the device down, she said simply, "Where did you send it?" "Home," Velshira said, a pause. "I hoped you would," Mara said. "You planned for it." "I hoped for it." Mara's voice was precise about the distinction. "I knew the resistance infrastructure on Velshi Prime exists. I've seen the briefings. I knew if you sent something they could receive, there were networks capable of receiving it. What they do with it is entirely their own decision, not mine, not yours. You gave them something to decide with." She paused. "That's more than they had yesterday." The comm device lit up again, and Mara was already reaching for it when the sound came. Not the sustained grid activation tone from earlier, but a sharper, compressed impact sound. The acoustic signature of something stopping very suddenly at very high velocity. Velshira knew this sound. She had reviewed tactical audio profiles in her mission preparation as a precautionary measure. And the signature was unmistakable. "Command vessel," she said. Mara was reading the device readout. "Intercept successful," she said. No crew casualties, the vessel's emergency evacuation systems deployed before impact. She looked up. They ran. At the end, they chose to run. They had time to decide, Velshira said. Yes, Mara said. They did. The dawn was arriving now in earnest, the canyon lit in the pale gold of first light that comes before the full sun and is somehow quieter than the light that follows. The sky above was an unmarked deep blue. It did not advertise what had occurred in it in the preceding 90 minutes, which was a quality the sky had always had, and which had never before seemed worth noting, and which now seemed like a fact about the world that contained more meaning than facts usually contain. Mara put the kettle on, which was what she did every morning without variation, and Velshira watched her do it and thought about all the mornings she had sat in this kitchen and cataloged this routine and filed it under subject's behavioral consistency as a vulnerability indicator, and she thought about what it felt like to have spent 17 days observing someone with complete attention and still to have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what you were looking at. She thought she probably owed that particular error some careful examination at some future point when there was time for it. Mara poured 2 mugs and brought them to the table and sat down across from Velshira in their customary positions, and, for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then, Mara said, "The debrief process is going to start fairly soon. A team will be here, my people, not the standard intake protocol. I've made that arrangement. You should be aware that I'll be separately debriefed regarding my decisions over the last 17 days, and those conversations are going to involve some procedural difficulty for me. Because you protected me," Velshira said. "Because I protected you by means that weren't logged through the standard channels, and because I used personal authorization to order an intercept that the Oversight Committee would have taken, at minimum 3 hours, to approve through proper process, and because I have been housing a Keth intelligence asset in my home for 17 days without reporting it to the intake queue." Mara said all of this with the quality of someone reciting a list they have already made their peace with. The review board will weigh those decisions against the operational outcome. I expect the outcome to be judged sufficient to offset the procedural irregularities. I've been through those reviews before. You did it because of the photographs, Velshira said. Mara looked at her, and the expression that crossed her face was not quite surprise and not quite confirmation, more like the look someone gets when they hear a thing they've been thinking said back to them in someone else's words and find that it holds up. "Yes," she said, "because of the photographs, because I've spent 22 years adding names to a list in my head, and I'm done adding them when I have the option not to." A pause. "I'm not under the impression that protecting one Velshi intelligence officer changes the arithmetic of the last 22 years. I'm under the impression that it changes what I do with this morning." The comm device activated again, and this time, the voice on the other end was demanding in the particular institutional ways of senior authority that has been waiting and would prefer not to have been. And Mara said she would be there within 2 hours, and ended the call with the same efficient brevity she applied to all the calls of that kind. She stood. She looked at Velshira. "The debrief team will arrive within the hour. You don't have to say anything. Until you've spoken with a liaison, we have Velshi community advocates who handle exactly this kind of situation. I can contact one before they arrive." She picked up her jacket, "But my advice is to tell them the truth. All of it, including the parts about my decisions. The true version is significantly simpler than any other version, and simpler holds up better under sustained questioning, including the part where you knew I was here and chose not to process me through the standard system. Including that," Mara said. "They'll reconstruct it regardless. Better they hear it consistent from both ends." She moved toward the hallway and stopped and turned back. "One more thing." "Yes?" "Miso has bitten 3 intelligence assessors in this house in the last 6 years, Mara said. "I consider her a reliable character judge. She never tried to bite you." She paused. "I took that seriously. She saw me toast from the counter on the 3rd morning." Velshira said, "I thought she might bite me for it." "She saw you." Mara confirmed. "She looked at you and she looked at the toast, and she went back to the window." A pause. "That means she concluded you were worth the toast. That's a form of clearance in this household." The small smile, the genuine one. "I'll be back this evening. Don't let anyone into the study. Tell them I said so." She walked down the hallway and out the front door, and Velshira heard the vehicle on the gravel and then it was gone, and the house settled into a particular quiet that was different from the quiet of the previous 17 mornings, thinner in some places and deeper in others, the quiet of a structure that has held something in and has now released it. The debrief team arrived 41 minutes later. There were 4 of them, carrying the compressed energy quality of people who had been moving since before dawn and had not finished moving. They were professional and courteous and careful, the way people are when they are uncertain how much latitude to extend to a situation their protocols did not fully anticipate, and Velshira told them the truth, which was, as Mara had said, significantly simpler than any available alternative. She told them about the employment agency, and the mission brief, and the 17 reports she had transmitted, and what each report had contained, and when the senior assessor asked what each report had not contained, she told them about the extraction protocol that was not in the mission architecture. She told them about 87 names on a list, and what the list meant when you read it alongside the routing string identifier from the 7th acknowledgement message. She told them about the burst transmission to Velshi Prime and the content of the message, and why she had sent it and when. She answered every question fully and did not allow anyone into the study, which she attributed to Dr. Chen's direct instruction, and the assessors accepted this without visible objection. Near the end of the session, the senior assessor, a lean woman who carried herself with the economy of someone who had learned very specifically where to put her attention, set down her stylus and looked at Velshira directly. "In your professional assessment," she said, "was Dr. Chen's handling of this operation consistent with standard Earth intelligence practice?" Velshira considered the question with the care it deserved. "No," she said. "In what specific respect?" "Standard practice," Velshira said, "would identify an incoming intelligence asset, determine the scope of their mission, develop a counterintelligence response, and manage the asset as an operational resource. The asset would be given access to what served the counterintelligence objective and not more. Information would be disclosed on a need-to-know basis determined by operational outcome rather than by any other consideration." She paused. "Dr. Chen gave me information that had no direct operational utility." "The list of Velshi assets," the assessor said. "Yes, and before that other things. The conversations, the access to the house, the time she gave me alone with information she knew I was processing." Velshis looked at the table. These were not operational choices, or they were not only operational choices, they were choices made on the basis of something else, something the standard framework does not have a clean category for. "Would you characterize them as mistakes?" the assessor said. Velshira thought about this, for what the assessor probably experienced as an unusually long pause. "No," she said finally. "I would characterize them as the choices someone makes when they have decided that the correct outcome and the right outcome are the same thing, and when they are willing to be accountable for that decision." The assessor wrote something down. She looked up. "One final question for the record. The transmission to Velshi Prime. Are you prepared to stand by that decision?" "Yes," Velshira said, without the 17 days of looking at the door. The assessors left in the early afternoon. Velshira was alone in the house for several hours, and she used those hours the way she used most of the time she had spent in this house, observing. But she was observing differently now, without the framework of vulnerability assessment and strategic categorization and operational relevance. She walked through the rooms and looked at what was in them, and she thought about what it meant to live in a space that you had deliberately structured as an instrument. And that was also, genuinely, your home, where the photographs were both a cover element and the actual weight of 22 years of grief, where the open doors were both a tactical decision and simply the way someone chose to live in a place they felt safe in. She thought about what it meant to have those things be the same thing, simultaneously, without contradiction. She sat in the window seat in the guest room and watched the light change on the canyon walls, the afternoon gold deepening toward the particular warm amber of late October, and she thought about the signal she had sent, traveling at the speed signals travel, and what might be waiting for it on the other end, and what might not be, and how there was no way to know yet, and how you sent the signal anyway because the alternative was not sending it. Mara returned at 7:43, later than she had said, with the specific quality of tiredness that comes from sustained formal engagement rather than physical work. She accepted the tea Velshira had ready, the kind she preferred, which Velshira had identified in the first week, the detail gathering never having entirely stopped, and sat at the table, and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when something was being processed rather than avoided. The review board, she said finally, found the operational outcome sufficient to offset the procedural approach. A pause. They were, as expected, significantly less enthusiastic about the approach than the outcome. There will be a formal notation in my record. She held the mug in both hands. I've had worse. Will it affect your position? Probably not. The outcome is large enough to generate some institutional goodwill. Whether that goodwill extends to covering the specific procedural decisions I made is a different question, one that will be answered over the next several months in various administrative venues. She drank her tea. I made the calls I made. I'll carry the record of them. Was it worth it? Velshira said. Mara looked at her for a moment. Ask me that again in 6 months, she said, when we know what came back from Velshi Prime. When we know whether the signal reached the right people and whether the right people did something with it. She set down her mug. Right now, I can only tell you that the alternative was something I've done before and did not want to do again. And I'm comfortable with that particular accounting. They were quiet for a moment together, the comfortable quiet that had developed without planning over 17 evenings, which was now a different kind of quiet, thinner on the surface and deeper underneath, the quiet of two people who know what they know about each other. I want to stay, Velshira said. Mara looked at her. I want to be here when the response comes from Velshi Prime, Velshira said. I want to be part of what comes next, if there is a next. She paused, organizing it. I want to do work that is genuinely mine and not a function that someone else assigned to me. And I think I can be useful to you in ways that do not involve transmitting information to foreign hostile entities. Mara looked at her for a long moment, and then she laughed, a sound significantly freer than the everyday version, the kind that escapes before it can be considered. That is, she said, an extraordinarily careful way to describe a career change. I have very specific training, Velshira said. Yes, Mara agreed. You do. She set the empty mug aside. I'll make the arrangements. It will take a few days to establish the formal status. You'll need to give me a name for the paperwork. Velshira was quiet. The name she had been using for this mission was the mission name, the Keth designation assigned at the time of her placement, the name that had been on her documents and her cover story and her transmission protocols for 11 years, and that was accurate in the technical sense of identifying her in the operational record, but had never been in any sense that felt real to her. Her name. She had another name, her birth name, the name her mother had given her, which followed the Velshi naming conventions of her region and carried, in its structure, the markers of where she had come from, the northern coastal settlements, the cliffs above the sea that she had left at the age of 18 when the Keth Administrative Authority had restructured the planet's educational institutions, and the path that led away from home had been the path available. She had dropped the regional suffix years ago. It was not useful in Keth operational contexts, and it made documents slightly more complicated, and she had told herself these were sufficient reasons to let it go. She had been telling herself that for a long time. She recognized, from 17 days of practice, the difference between telling yourself something and it being true. My name is Velshira Rin, she said. Velshira because my mother gave me that. Rin because that is the northern coastal suffix, from the region where I was born, and I have been in the habit of leaving it off because it is not functionally necessary in operational contexts. She paused. I would like to use the full name. Mara said it back to her, carefully, giving the syllables the attention she gave to things that she had decided mattered. Velshira Rin. She nodded once. I'll remember that, yes, Velshira Rin said. I believe you will. They sat in the kitchen for a while longer, not talking very much, and the canyon outside held the last of the evening light before releasing it to the dark, and somewhere in the dark, a small, yellow bird settled on the window latch and regarded them both with the serene, evaluative judgment of something that had made its own assessment and considered the matter resolved. Later, after dinner, Velshira Rin stood in the bathroom of the guest room, in the room with the window seat and the good light, in the room that had not been the servants' quarters, in the room where the distinction that Mara had named on the first morning had been the first thing that made no sense, and turned out to be the key to every sense that followed, and looked at her own reflection in the mirror. The mirror was ordinary glass. It told you what was there without interpretation or softening, which was exactly what mirrors were for and which made them, she had always thought, one of the more honest objects in any given space. She was small, by the standards of nearly every spacefaring species she had encountered, and her eyes were the large, dark variety adapted for low-light environments, and her hands had the fine motor control that the galaxy catalogued as her species' defining characteristic, and the Keth Dominion had catalogued as the quality that made her species useful to deploy as disposable forward assets. Both of these things were true. Neither of them was the most true thing about the hands she was looking at. She had sent 87 names across 47 light-years to the world that they had come from. She did not know if any of those names had left behind people who were still listening, families who still lit the memorial lamps that the northern coastal tradition kept in windows to guide the dead home. She did not know if the resistance networks Mara had mentioned existed in the operational reality, or only in the intelligence briefings that described them, which was never quite the same thing. She did not know if the 7 words at the end of her message had been the right 7 words, or simply the most honest ones available. She knew that she had sent them. She knew that this was not nothing. The signal would arrive, or it would not. The networks would receive it, or they would not. The world she had left would respond, or it would remain as it had been. These outcomes were not in her hands. They were in the hands of 87 families and an uncounted number of people on occupied cliffs above a sea she had not seen in 6 years. And what those people did with information was, as Mara had said, entirely their own choice. And giving someone a choice they did not have before was not the same as determining what they did with it. The distinction mattered. She was learning from someone who had spent 22 years learning it herself how much the distinction mattered. She turned off the light and went to the window seat and sat with the canyon in the dark, the enormous quiet of it, the way it held the stars at this altitude without filtering or diminishing them, and she thought about what it felt like to have a name that was fully her own, not a mission designation, not a Keth operational handle, not the shortened version she had carried out of habit and efficiency, and the gradual erosion of things you don't actively maintain, and how it was strange and how it was good, and how strange and good were often, she was discovering, the same direction. In the morning she would find out whether the canyon at dawn looked different when you were looking at it as yourself. She expected it would look very different. She expected, in the careful, evidence-based, professionally rigorous way she had been trained to form expectations, that it would look exactly like what she had been looking at all along, seen correctly for the first time.